took 3 grown men to lift it off the ground, 215 pounds, nearly 18 feet long. The biologists who found it said later that there was a moment of collective disbelief when they finally got it onto the scale. A silence, because the number didn't seem possible, because nothing that large was supposed to be hiding in the swamps of South Florida, slipping silently between the cypress trees, unseen by almost every person who has ever walked those trails. And when they cut it open in the lab, what they found inside confirmed the worst fear that had been building among wildlife biologists for over a decade. Hoof cores, bone fragments, fur, the unmistakable remains of an adult white-tailed deer, swallowed whole by a single snake. This is not science fiction. This is not an exaggerated headline designed to get clicks. This is a real, ongoing, scientifically documented ecological catastrophe unfolding right now in one of the most famous wilderness areas in the United States. And the footage that keeps surfacing from deep inside Florida's swamps, the trail cameras, the night vision recordings, the necropsy photographs taken in research labs in Naples and Fort Myers, tells a story that almost nobody outside of Florida fully understands. The Everglades, one of the most ecologically unique landscapes on the planet, is being quietly and systematically emptied of its native wildlife. And the cause is a snake that was never supposed to be there at all. To understand how something this serious happened, you have to go back to the exotic pet trade of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, a trade that, with stunning carelessness, brought one of the largest constrictor snakes on Earth into American households as a novelty pet. The Burmese python is native to the jungles, grasslands, and river valleys of Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, parts of southern China. In its native range, it is actually considered a species vulnerable to extinction, hunted for its skin and for traditional medicine, its numbers shrinking under pressure from humans. But thousands of these snakes were captured, bred, and shipped to the United States to be sold as pets, often to people who had no real understanding of what they were bringing into their homes. A Burmese python hatchling is small enough to coil comfortably in the palm of a child's hand. That is precisely the problem. The snake that fits adorably in a hand at 8 weeks old can, within a few short years, grow into an animal 16, 17, even 19 feet long. An animal capable of overpowering and consuming an adult deer. Pet owners across Florida, faced with an animal that had outgrown their house, their budget, and their capacity to handle it safely, did what an alarming number of people quietly chose to do. They drove to the edge of the Everglades and let it go. The first confirmed sightings of wild Burmese pythons in Everglades National Park date back to the 1980s. For years, these sightings were treated as isolated curiosities, strange but rare anomalies, a handful of escaped or released pets struggling to survive in an unfamiliar climate. What nobody fully appreciated at the time was that South Florida's climate is, in almost every meaningful way, a near-perfect substitute for the python's native habitat in Southeast Asia. Warm, humid, full of dense vegetation for camouflage, crisscrossed with waterways for movement, and almost entirely free of natural predators capable of challenging a fully grown adult python. The Everglades did not just tolerate the Burmese python, it welcomed it as if the ecosystem had been waiting for it. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, what had once been scattered, isolated sightings had become something else entirely. A breeding population, self-sustaining, expanding, and almost completely invisible. That invisibility is, in many ways, the most unsettling part of this entire story. Burmese pythons are masters of camouflage, their mottled brown and tan skin blending seamlessly into the leaf litter, the tangled roots, and the dappled light of the Everglades understory. Wildlife biologists working in the field have made a sobering estimate, one that should reframe how anyone thinks about the scale of this problem. Researchers believe that only about 1% of the Burmese pythons living in South Florida are ever actually seen or captured by a human being. 1%. That statistic means that for every python that ends up in a research lab, on a hunter's truck bed, or in a viral video online, there are roughly 99 more moving undetected through the swamps, the canals, the hammocks, and the sawgrass prairies of South Florida. Current population estimates for the python invasion range from the tens of thousands at the conservative end to as many as 100,000, or possibly even more, spread across a python-occupied range that has grown to cover well over 1,000 square miles of South Florida, including Everglades National Park, Big Cypress National Preserve, and increasingly areas well to the north of where the species was first established. Ian Bartoszek, a wildlife biologist with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida who has spent more than a decade tracking these animals, has described the python crisis in blunt terms. This is the wildlife issue of our time for southern Florida. Not one issue among many. The issue. The thing that, more than any other single factor, is reshaping what lives and what does not live in one of the most biodiverse wetland ecosystems in North America. The scientific data on what these snakes have done to the Everglades' native wildlife is not speculative. It comes from one of the most rigorous wildlife studies ever conducted in the region, published by researchers studying mammal populations across multiple sections of Everglades National Park, comparing current numbers against historical baseline data collected before the python invasion took hold. What they found, published in a landmark study, should be read slowly because the numbers do not initially seem real. Since 1997, raccoon populations in the parts of the Everglades most heavily colonized by pythons have declined by 99.3%. Not 99.3% of a small or insignificant population. 99.3% of what used to be one of the most common and successful mammals in the entire ecosystem. Opossum populations, similarly, have collapsed by 98.9%. Bobcats, one of the region's signature predators, an animal built to compete at the top of the food chain, have fallen by 87.5%. In the most severely affected, most remote southern regions of the park, where pythons have had the longest uninterrupted time to establish themselves, marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes are now considered functionally extirpated, locally extinct, gone from areas where they used to be common in a time frame of mere decades. Across all medium-sized mammal species in the region collectively, biologists have documented declines exceeding 90% in the areas hit hardest by the python invasion. This is not a slow, gradual ecological shift of the kind that typically takes centuries to unfold. This is a near total collapse of an entire trophic level of an ecosystem, happening within the span of a single human lifetime, driven overwhelmingly by one invasive predator species that was never supposed to be there. What makes the Burmese python such a uniquely devastating predator in this particular ecosystem is the staggering range of animals it is physically capable of killing and eating. University of Florida researchers, conducting necropsies on captured pythons over many years, have documented the remains of 24 different mammal species, 47 different bird species, and 2 reptile species inside python stomachs. This is not a snake with a narrow specialized diet. This is a generalist apex predator capable of consuming nearly anything in the ecosystem small enough, or as it turns out, not even that much smaller, than itself. In December 2021, the python research team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida captured what remains, as of now, the largest Burmese python ever documented in the state of Florida. The snake was a female, measuring nearly 18 feet in length, 17 feet and 7 inches to be exact, and weighing 215 pounds. To put that in perspective, when fully stretched out, her body was roughly the same length as a fully grown giraffe is tall. It took 3 researchers to physically carry her out of the field. The team had been using a method that sounds almost too clever to be real, but is in fact one of the most effective wildlife tracking techniques ever developed for this species. Male Burmese pythons, fitted with surgically implanted radio transmitters, are released back into the wild during the breeding season. These scout snakes, as the biologists call them, are then tracked using radio signals as they instinctively seek out the largest, most reproductively active females in the area, because that is precisely what a male python is biologically driven to do. As Bartoszek has explained it, the best python detector on the planet is a male Burmese python during breeding season. Using scouts, his team has been able to locate exactly the kind of snake that does the most ecological damage: large, breeding, egg-laying females. When this particular record-breaking female was brought back to the lab and humanely euthanized, the subsequent necropsy revealed 2 records simultaneously. The first was almost beyond comprehension. 122 developing eggs found inside her abdomen, nearly triple the average clutch size of around 43 eggs, and the highest number ever recorded for the species in Florida. The second finding answered the question every researcher in that lab was almost certainly already asking. In her digestive tract, biologists found hoof cores, the hard, keratinized remnants of an animal's hooves, undigested even after the rest of the carcass had broken down. The python's last meal had been an adult white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are not just another prey species in this ecosystem. They are, among other things, one of the primary food sources for the critically endangered Florida panther, a subspecies teetering on the edge of extinction, with a wild population numbering only in the low hundreds. Every deer a python removes from the landscape is a meal taken directly out of the mouth of one of the most endangered large mammals in North America. The python is not simply adding a new predator to the food web, it is actively starving out the predators that were already there. The 215-pound python did not hold the record for long in terms of the broader pattern of escalating discoveries. In the years since, hunters and researchers across South Florida have continued to pull astonishing specimens out of the swamps. In one widely reported case, a group of 5 men in Big Cypress National Preserve came upon a python stretched out so far across a remote road that, in the words of one of the men who helped subdue it, there was no way to miss it. It looked like it stretched the entire width of the road itself. The five of them, strangers to one another moments before, spent more than 45 minutes wrestling the animal to the ground. When it was finally weighed, the python came in at 198 pounds, the second heaviest ever recorded in the state. One of the men who fought it later said simply that it was more than a snake, it was a monster. Professional python hunters, a small but growing community of specialists who track, capture, and remove these animals as both a conservation service and, for some, a livelihood, have described similar encounters. One hunter, recounting the capture of an exceptionally large specimen, said her hands were shaking as she approached it, that in years of experience she had never seen a snake anywhere near that size, and that every python caught carries potential danger, but one of that scale was, in her own word, lethal. The state of Florida, recognizing the scale of the crisis, has poured increasing resources into removal efforts. Programs using radio-tagged scout snakes, professional contracted hunters working for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the South Florida Water Management District, and an annual public competition called the Florida Python Challenge, which has drawn hundreds of participants from across dozens of states competing for cash prizes for the most pythons removed, have together accounted for the capture and removal of more than 23,000 Burmese pythons from Florida's ecosystems to date. In a single month of intensified effort in July 2025 alone, removal teams captured and euthanized 748 pythons, more than triple the number removed during the same month the previous year, a sign both of escalating effort and, more troublingly, of just how many snakes remain out there to be found. And yet, when measured against population estimates running into the tens of thousands or more, even 23,000 removed pythons represents only a fraction of the total invasive population. Biologists are candid about what this means. Outright eradication of the species from the Everglades, at this point, is not considered a realistic goal by the scientists working most closely on the problem. The python is here permanently. What remains achievable, and what current research and removal efforts are actually aimed at, is containment, slowing the spread, protecting the most vulnerable remaining pockets of native wildlife, and preventing the python's range from expanding further north into ecosystems that have not yet been affected. The contributing factors behind the population's explosive growth go beyond simple escape and release. In August 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida as one of the most powerful and destructive hurricanes ever to strike the continental United States. Among the structures it obliterated were several commercial reptile breeding facilities housing large numbers of Burmese pythons intended for the pet trade. When those facilities were destroyed, an unknown but almost certainly substantial number of additional pythons were released directly into the wild in a single catastrophic event, compounding decades of smaller-scale releases by individual pet owners and giving the wild population a sudden, significant injection of new breeding stock at a moment when the species was just beginning to establish its foothold in the region. Once established, the python's biology did the rest. Female Burmese pythons can lay extraordinarily large clutches of eggs, as the 122-egg necropsia result demonstrated. They reach sexual maturity within a relatively short number of years. They have an extremely broad diet capable of sustaining rapid growth. And once they exceed roughly 6 feet in length, they have essentially no natural predators anywhere in the Everglades ecosystem capable of threatening them. There is no animal in South Florida evolved to compete with, or to prey upon, an apex predator that did not exist anywhere in the Americas until humans accidentally introduced it. There have been a small handful of remarkable exceptions to that rule, the kind of stories that make headlines precisely because they are so rare. In one widely reported case, a Florida bobcat was documented killing a 13-foot Burmese python. The first time such an event had ever been recorded, evidence that the Everglades' native predators are not entirely without recourse, even against an animal many times their size. But these instances remain the exception that proves the rule rather than evidence of any meaningful natural check on the python population. For every python killed by a bobcat, there are pythons consuming dozens of bobcats, raccoons, rabbits, and birds in return. The exchange rate, ecologically speaking, is brutally lopsided. What is perhaps most striking about the entirety of this crisis is how quietly it has unfolded relative to its scale. There has been no single dramatic, telegenic disaster moment. No flood, no fire, no hurricane footage broadcast across every news channel in the country. Instead, there has been a slow, almost silent emptying out of an ecosystem, tracked carefully by biologists through trail cameras, road surveys, radio telemetry, and the grim arithmetic of mammal population counts, conducted year after year in the same fixed survey locations. The marsh rabbit that used to be common along a particular trail simply stops appearing in the data. The raccoon tracks that used to be everywhere along the canal banks gradually thin out, then vanish almost entirely. Nothing explodes, nothing burns. An entire layer of the food web simply, quietly disappears. This is precisely why so much of the public remains largely unaware of how severe the situation has actually become. As one regional research summary put it bluntly, the python's horrendous impact on the Everglades ecosystem is finally being recognized by scientists, even as much of the general public in South Florida remains largely oblivious to the scale of what is already happening and to the future consequences of a rapidly multiplying, voracious predator capable of growing to nearly 20 feet in length. The cascading effects extend well beyond the species directly eaten by pythons. As populations of rabbits, raccoons, and opossums collapse, the predators and scavengers that depend on those animals, birds of prey, bobcats, and others further up the food chain, face their own secondary declines from lost food sources. Seed dispersal patterns shift as the small mammals responsible for spreading plant seeds throughout the ecosystem disappear. Vegetation growth patterns change in response. The Everglades is not simply losing individual species, it is being rewired link by link through a food web that took thousands of years to develop into its current form, and that is now being restructured within the span of a few decades by a single invasive predator with no evolutionary history in this hemisphere at all. The footage that surfaces again and again from deep inside Florida's swamps, biologists wading chest deep through black water in pursuit of a radio signal, hunters straining against the thrashing coils of an animal larger than most adult humans, necropsy tables and sterile labs where researchers carefully extract the undeniable physical evidence of what has been lost, all of it points toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The Everglades that exists today is not the Everglades that existed 30 years ago. The raccoons, the rabbits, the opossums, the bobcats that once defined this landscape have been pushed to the edge of local extinction across vast stretches of its most remote and supposedly best protected interior. And the animal responsible weighs as much as 2 grown men combined, can swallow an adult deer whole, and remains, even now, almost entirely unseen, 99 times out of 100, by anyone who walks past it. The aftermath in Florida's swamps was never going to look like a disaster movie. It was always going to look like silence, like a trail camera that used to capture a raccoon every single night, and now captures nothing at all, like a biologist standing in a lab, staring at a scale reading 215 pounds and feeling for a moment the full and terrifying weight of what has been allowed to happen, one quiet release into the swamp at a time, until an entire ecosystem's future hung in the balance of a single invasive species nobody planned for and almost nobody can fully see.